It's 70,000 years ago. You're sitting at the edge of a fire. It's dark in a way that modern humans genuinely cannot imagine. No cities on the horizon, no distant hum of traffic, just black. And then something moves out there in the dark. Something big, and it doesn't come closer, and it doesn't leave. And you have no word for what it is, no framework, no explanation, just the sound, the dark, and a feeling building in your chest that the human species had never felt before. That feeling became the first god. But here's the question nobody actually asks. Why gods? Why not just fear? Why not just run? Every animal on Earth hears something in the dark and runs. They don't build temples. They don't name what scared them. They don't carve its face into stone and bring it offerings 1,000 years later. So what happened between the sound in the dark and the first religion? What happened inside the human brain that no other brain on Earth has ever done? The answer isn't faith. It isn't meaning. It isn't even fear. Not exactly. It's something far more specific, far more strange. And once you understand it, you will never look at a church, a mosque, a temple, or a quiet moment of prayer the same way again. Let's start with what we think we know. The popular story about religion goes something like this. Early humans were terrified of the world around them. Thunder, disease, death, things they couldn't explain, and so they invented gods to explain them. The thunder god, the rain god, the god of the harvest. Religion, in this version of history, is a placeholder. It's what you believe before you have science. A comfort blanket for a species not yet smart enough to know better. It's a clean story. It's also almost certainly wrong. Here's the problem with that theory. It assumes that religion is a mistake, that primitive minds reached for a supernatural explanation because they lacked a natural one. But that's not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows something far more interesting. Religion didn't emerge because human brains were too simple to understand the world. It emerged because human brains were sophisticated enough to do something no other brain could do. And that thing, that specific cognitive ability, is the reason you are watching this right now. Think about this. In 1994, a team of archaeologists working in southeastern Turkey made a discovery that rewrote the timeline of human religion entirely. They found a site called Göbekli Tepe, a complex of massive stone pillars carved with animals and abstract symbols arranged in deliberate circular formations. Some of the pillars weighed 10 to 20 tons. They had been shaped, transported, and erected with extraordinary precision, and it predated agriculture by at least 1,000 years. Let that land for a moment. The oldest known religious monument on Earth was built before humans had figured out how to farm, before permanent settlements, before any of the social infrastructure we normally associate with organized religion. Hunter-gatherers, people with no fixed home, no surplus food, no architectural tradition, dragged 20-ton stones across miles of landscape and built something that could only have been a temple, not a shelter, not a storage facility. A temple, which means religion didn't grow out of civilization. Civilization may have grown out of religion, but that still doesn't answer the real question. Why? What was happening inside those minds that made them do this? This is where the science gets genuinely uncomfortable. In the 1990s, cognitive scientist Justin Barrett introduced a concept that has since become one of the most important ideas in the study of human religion. He called it the Hyperactive Agency Detection Device, HAD. It sounds like a joke. It isn't. Here's what it means. Your brain is constantly, automatically, and unconsciously scanning your environment for agents, things with intentions, things that can act on purpose. This is not a choice. You cannot turn it off. And there is an extremely good evolutionary reason why it exists. Imagine you are walking through tall grass 100,000 years ago. You hear a rustle. Your brain has two options. Option 1, assume it's the wind. Relax. Option 2, assume it's a predator. Run. If you choose option 1 and you're wrong, you die. If you choose option 1 and you're wrong, you wasted a few seconds of energy. The math is obvious. Natural selection ruthlessly favored the brains that defaulted to option 2. The brains that saw agents everywhere. The brains that assume intention behind every sound, every movement, every unexplained event. Those brains survived. The relaxed brains became someone else's lunch. And so, over hundreds of thousands of years, the human brain was refined into something extraordinarily sensitive to the presence of agents. Too sensitive, as it turns out. Hyperactive. And a hyperactive agent detection system, running in a world full of unexplained events, will do something completely predictable. It will find agents that aren't there. Thunder isn't just noise. Something made that noise. The river didn't just flood. Something caused it to flood. The child didn't just get sick, something decided the child would get sick. Your brain is not reaching for a supernatural explanation because it's primitive. It's reaching for an agent because that is exactly what it was designed to do. The God isn't a mistake. The God is the output of a brain working precisely as intended, in conditions it wasn't designed for. This is not a small distinction. It changes everything about how we understand religion. But here's where it gets more complicated, because HADD explains why humans see agents. It doesn't fully explain why those agents became gods. Why worship? Why sacrifice? Why build Göbekli Tepe? Why drag 20-ton stones across the landscape for something you can't see? To understand that, you have to understand something about the social problem ancient humans were trying to solve. And it was a very specific problem, a deadly one. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar, the same researcher who discovered that human social groups naturally cap at around 150 people, spent years studying the relationship between religion and social behavior. And what he found changes the entire framing. Early human groups faced a problem that no other species faced at the same scale. They were smart enough to cheat, smart enough to defect, smart enough to take more than their share, to lie about what they'd hunted, to free ride on the effort of others, to act in their own interests at the expense of the group. And in a small band of 50 people on the edge of survival, one consistent cheater could destroy everyone. You needed a system. You needed something that made people behave even when no one was watching. You needed, in other words, an agent that was always watching. An agent that knew your intentions, not just your actions. An agent you couldn't hide from, couldn't bribe, couldn't outlast. You needed a god. In 2006, psychologists Ara Narenzayan and Azam Sharif ran a series of experiments that have since become foundational in the cognitive science of religion. They gave participants money and told them they could either keep it or donate it to a stranger. Half the group was subtly primed with religious concepts beforehand. Words like spirit, divine, God slipped into an unrelated task. The other half received no such priming. The religiously primed group donated nearly twice as much. Not because they were more religious, because the concept of a watching agent, even an unconscious one, changed their behavior. The effect is called the watching eyes effect. And it is so powerful that even a poster of eyes on a wall increases honest behavior in people who don't believe anyone is actually watching. Now imagine not a poster, imagine a god. An all-seeing, all-knowing agent who watches everything you do and responds to it. Who remembers, who judges, who has the power to reward and punish in ways that no human authority can match. That is the most powerful social technology ever invented, not a comfort blanket, a behavioral system. And it worked. Societies with what researchers call big gods, moralizing, all-seeing, punishment-delivering deities, consistently show higher levels of cooperation, lower levels of defection, and greater capacity for large-scale social organization than societies without them. This isn't a religious argument. This is a measurable, documented, cross-cultural finding that has been replicated dozens of times. The gods solved the cooperation problem. The god made civilization possible. And yet, here's what nobody talks about. The people who built Göbekli Tepe didn't write anything down. We don't know what they believed. We don't know what they called their gods, if gods is even the right word. We don't know what happened inside those stone circles. But we know they kept coming back. We know they brought animals. We know they ate together and left traces of enormous communal feasts. And we know they buried the whole complex intentionally, deliberately filled it in with soil around 8000 BC and walked away. Why? We don't know. That question may never be answered, but the act of burial itself tells us something. These were not people who stumbled into religion by accident. They were people who built something, used it, decided they were finished with it, and put it to rest. That is not primitive. That is extraordinarily human. Let's come forward in time, because the same pattern appears everywhere, independently, without contact. The ancient Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Indus Valley civilization, the early Chinese dynasties, the Mesoamerican cultures, all of them, on separate continents, without sharing ideas, arrived at the same basic architecture. A powerful sky deity or pantheon, a moral code tied to divine will, a priestly class who mediated between humans and the watching agent, rituals that reinforced group identity, consequences for defection that extended beyond death. Not the same gods, not the same stories, but the same structure, every time, everywhere, because the structure wasn't arbitrary. It was solving the same problem every large human group eventually faces. How do you make strangers trust each other? How do you build a society out of people who have no reason to cooperate? You give them a shared watcher. You give them a shared story. You give them a god. In 2015, a study published in the journal Nature analyzed 96 societies across history and found a clear pattern. Large-scale societies almost always developed belief in moralizing gods before they developed complex social institutions, not after. Before, the god didn't emerge from civilization, the god enabled it. Religion wasn't the product of human progress. It was the mechanism of human progress. That finding is still debated, it is still uncomfortable, and it is still one of the most important things social science has discovered in the last 20 years. Here's the part that should sit with you. You live in a world that has largely replaced the watching god with watching systems, cameras, laws, credit scores, social media, algorithms that track your behavior and respond to it, rating systems that follow you from platform to platform. Everywhere you go, something is watching. Something is recording, something is judging, and the effect on human behavior is identical. You act differently when you think you're being observed. Every study ever conducted on this confirms it. A mechanism your ancestors built gods to provide, you have rebuilt in silicon and code. The god didn't disappear. It was reconstructed, piece by piece, platform by platform. And most of us didn't even notice we were doing it. There is a skeleton in a cave in what is now Indonesia. It is at least 45,000 years old, and on the wall of the cave beside where this person was buried, there is a painting of a pig. It is the oldest known figurative artwork in the world. The person who painted it looked at an animal and decided to represent it, to make it exist in a form that would outlast the moment, to create something permanent out of something fleeting. That is the same impulse that built Göbekli Tepe. That is the same impulse that carved the first idol. That is the same impulse that whispered into the dark and waited to see if something answered. We are the species that looks at the world and cannot accept that it has no author, cannot accept that the sound in the dark is just wind, cannot accept that the dead are simply gone. And so we listen, we build, we name the thing in the dark. We drag 20-ton stones across the landscape and arrange them in a circle and gather inside them and do something that, 70,000 years later, billions of people are still doing. We reach for something we cannot prove is there. And we have never in all of human history been able to stop. That's not a flaw. That is the oldest thing about us.